I'm here with John Mraz in downtown Toronto. John, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm Toronto born and bred, and I've spent my life working in politics and as a writer. I think both an interesting thing to do and what a gift in terms of a vocation. I don't even see it as a job, as an activity with which to fill my life. But 90% of my work has been political, both as a journalist and also as a strategist, and I suppose an analyst. I guess that's three things. I continue to work in media, although more in the back scenes now in terms of production, but I do join podcasts and regularly comment on politics generally, actually, in the Middle East and in the post-Soviet republics, which are two regions that I spent a great deal of time in and remain fascinated with. But here we are in downtown Toronto.
Thank you, John. I'm going to go ahead and start here. Toronto's homeless population exceeds 10,000. What steps can be taken to raise public awareness and mobilize action to address this crisis?
So I'm going to challenge that fact right off the front. Toronto's homeless population was, prior to COVID, probably already 10,000. I don't think anybody knows what the number is now. Estimates vary between 30,000 to 80,000. Politicians tend to mitigate the number because, of course, the larger the number is, the more concerned people become, because homeless populations, of course, are disruptive, not through any fault of their own, because they need somewhere to live, which can look like encampments in parks. It can look like occupying the subway in the winter. It can look like squatting in abandoned homes or condominiums that aren't being used. It can look like bed blocking in hospitals. But we are at a crisis point in Toronto. We simply don't have the accommodation, the mental health, the physical health, and seemingly any decent ideas to solve a problem that was exacerbated in particular by 2 years of rapid unemployment in COVID. And let's remember, Toronto was the most locked down city in the world. While people were receiving checks, they were subsistence checks. During that period, inflation spiked higher than it had in decades. It became untenable to pay one's rent because real estate prices didn't go down, and feed oneself at the grocery store. So people who probably had never been homeless have joined the ranks of those who already were for a variety of reasons.
Thank you. With 67% of the homeless facing mental illness, how can we effectively tackle misdiagnosis to improve access to the right treatment?
Okay. I think even the most hearty-souled, the most self-aware person confronted by homelessness, whether you're a migrant trying to cross the border of the United States from Latin America, whether you're Palestinian or an Israeli displaced by a horrible war that right this weekend celebrates its first anniversary, whether you're Ukrainians displaced by a Russian invasion, or whether you're just one of millions of homeless people who live in, for instance, India, it takes an immediate toll on your psyche. So, misdiagnosis. Homeless individuals, certainly here in Toronto, find often solace or relief from the pain in substance abuse. They may or may not even be historically alcoholics or addicts, but when you have no sense of security, often the easiest and the most available route to solve just getting through the day is to anesthetize yourself. Now, the problem with that is if you start taking hard, cheap drugs or drinking to excess, you will change as a human being. And so your diagnosis will increase. And we like to use all sorts of words, narcissist disorder, bipolar, psychotic, and any other number of diagnoses that are out there. Are they getting the right diagnoses? Maybe, maybe not. Certainly, we do not have the capacity, even if the number is as low as 20,000, to administer, take in, effectively diagnose, medicate, oversee their medication, and see them get the talk therapy and the physical therapy they need to get well so they have a chance of reintegrating into our community, get a job, find a place they can afford. That's a big problem itself. So, I mean, I should in full disclosure say, years ago I ran a war room for a mayor-elect, somebody who was elected, and I learned a fair amount about Toronto's infrastructure in so doing, and what our capacity in terms of housing is, even for people with money. So, now you're homeless, you might be getting a check, a small check, certainly not a check you could live on and pay rent with and pay groceries with on a monthly basis. The first challenge would be to find these people somewhere to live so they could have the security and safety of a domicile and access then to a medical health or mental health system, say at CAMH or one of the big hospitals, so they could be diagnosed. And then they've got to be able to pay for the medication that's usually attendant, the way we treat mental illness. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, I'm not sure. And then you've got to give them social work support, psychological, psychotherapeutic support to help them overcome the trauma of even a few months of homelessness, especially for those who've never experienced that. So, misdiagnosis is the least of our problems. Any diagnosis is our problem. Finding the capacity, the money, the professionals, the social workers, the infrastructure necessary to even begin to solve the problem is right now seemingly beyond our reach in our economic frame as it exists today. Failing are raising taxes at a rate so severe that the very people who provide jobs and build housing wouldn't want to stay in Canada anymore and would seek other places to make money that were not as prohibitive. I wish that I had better news to give you, but the encampments aren't going away. Winter is coming. Our homeless will retreat down into the subways. And even if the promises that the federal government, the provincial government, and the municipal government come true, it takes years to build housing, which means right now we have a problem that is, while it might not be permanent, is certainly a problem we're going to be challenged with for at least 5 years to come.
Thank you. The $5 billion investment from the Trudeau government for mental health is definitely a significant commitment. Right now, opioid-related deaths have surged by 79%. What do you think are the immediate strategies that should be implemented or prioritized to address this very urgent crisis?
$5 billion is a drop in the bucket if you're talking about, because at this point we've only been talking about the homeless here in Toronto. There are homeless in Vancouver, there are homeless in Belleville, there are homeless in Ottawa, there are homeless in North Bay now. Towns and cities that have never seen a homeless problem are experiencing homeless issues well beyond their local capacity in terms of the charities and social work and government, agencies that are supposed to solve these problems. So this is a pan-Canadian problem. And as I mentioned earlier on, one of the things that seems to be proven is once you get a homeless encampment, I think of the one down at Trinity Bellwoods Park, I think one of the most famous and largest ones. It becomes a community, almost a carnival of anesthetic. When we talk about the opiate problem, we're not talking about heroin anymore, or even Percocet. We are talking about fentanyl, which is cheap, readily available, and one of the toughest addictions to beat. A single use of fentanyl, but certainly 2 or 3 uses of fentanyl, generally leads to almost immediate addiction. Fentanyl is so strong, so unregulated, and so pervasive that our kids are dying. But it's not just kids. There are middle-class people who've ended up homeless in their 50s and 60s, dying of fentanyl across the country every day. It's very tough to resuscitate them. It's very tough to treat them after the fact. The detox alone demands days, if not weeks, and treatment then for the urge to to use again is something that is some complicated knitting when you're talking about psychoanalysis, or you're talking about providing remedies or a different way of finding or getting your power back, of finding a path of hope that leads you to believe that you will not live in emotional and spiritual agony on a daily basis. As long as fentanyl is flooding our streets, and I'm not faulting the police here or our customs agents or borders, we have so many, from coast to coast to coast, there are 3 borders and hundreds of thousands of miles that you can slide things in. We have a postal service, and we have cargo container, shipping yards, West Coast, East Coast, Montreal, with literally millions of cargo containers that cannot all be searched. So supply is almost impossible to stop. So what do you do? Well, if you're going to try and solve the homeless problem, $5 billion be damned. Now you're talking more like $500 billion. And then you've got to add to that investment the creation of not 10 or 20, but hundreds of treatment centers to deal specifically with opiate addiction, the toughest of the addictions, right? And then you've got to offer support networks that help these people retrain, retool, and find jobs, and find enough of a sense of security that they're prepared to risk some hope and find enough value, meaning, and love in their lives that they can survive without those hard drugs. This is a crisis beyond almost repair, some people think. I've yet to hear anybody really talk about it and tell the truth. And there's a cynical view out there, because of course there are countries, usually tyrannies around the world, and their simple view is drug addicts are supposed to die. And we shouldn't waste our money, because we're talking about tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars for each addict that you really want to take care of. That is, in the Darwinian sense, their fate, and there's nothing we can do about it. The problem, of course, with that is, first of all, it lacks any vestige or nuance of humanity. There's nothing decent or loving about that. These are people who often have ended up in circumstances that were created by a corporate or a political environment over which they have control. The real problem is the disruption to the rest of the community. And so the community at large becomes resentful that these people have encamped in their parks, are on the street, manifesting Tourette'sian, symptoms, manifesting violent behavior, manifesting disruptive behavior, robbing stores with impunity because they have nothing to lose. So Canadians, who have historically been a very compassionate, sympathetic people, are losing their patience with the disruption to their lives. And it's not that I don't think, I've heard this term today, it was introduced to me, this ostrich syndrome, putting your head in the sand. I don't think people are putting their head in the sand. I've lived in a lot of big cities around the world that have had these problems for decades. I see many Canadians who are gentle still to this moment with the homeless, with the mentally ill. I see people who are the most unlikely candidates talk people who are having a psychotic episode down. The police, of course, are ill-equipped to deal with any of this. That's really not what they're trained to do. There's some merit to arguments that some of their budget should go to EMS and social and healthcare workers to intervene when there are episodes with the homeless or with folks who are not even necessarily homeless, but mostly living on the street and hustling for their survival, usually through petty crimes or, just harassment or petty theft. So there are two kinds of Torontonians. The other kind of Torontonians that I know are people who, because the economy has been so tough, recognize that they are 1 degree of separation away from those people they're walking by who are sleeping on the sidewalk. Because just the cost of living for an average working class, working family unit has become so high that they are praying that they get through their next mortgage payment, their rent payment, their heating bill, or their trip to No Frills. And so when they see those people, their feeling is one of terror. Not that they're frightened of what the homeless will do to them, but they're frightened of what the very real possibility that is what they will become. This creates class resentment. The middle class slowly evaporates. Those who've moved up into permanent security because they had the great opportunity for a decent education or just luck, genetic luck, live less and less in downtown Toronto since COVID, so they don't see it. I know any number of people, friends of mine with some money, who've decided they will spend most of their time at their cottage, their chalet, a second home outside of the parameters of Toronto. So they don't, maybe that's ostrich syndrome. They don't even have to see it, right? And so it's not a problem they feel it's their responsibility to address. And then us folks who take the subway, etc. A lot of the time I'm just sad. There were points where I was angry, but having worked within governments of all levels, and I would say at least upper middle class, if not senior positions, I am aware of how difficult it is to disperse money effectively that won't be wasted on bureaucracy, an overregulated environment, and with the diminishment of faith. In other words, most Torontonians at this point, no matter how they identify in terms of their religion, they're not active in their religion. So they no longer even have those points on Sunday or Friday or Saturday where they congregate and talk about helping the community. That's another huge loss. So you have atomization of a population that speak less and less to each other. And when they see the homeless, I don't think it's that they're not seeing them. I think they just feel powerless or terrified.
Thank you. How do you think foreign investment ties into this whole situation with the rising housing prices? Is there anything, how deep is that catalyst? How far does that rabbit hole go?
There's been, of course, a long discourse, and I'm no expert in this particular discourse, about foreign investment in condominiums that sit empty, that are just simply an investment in equity, because traditionally real estate prices go slowly up no matter what else happens in the economy. And so there's frustration amongst people who care about these issues, and they say, we shouldn't allow that. People shouldn't be allowed to buy Canadian real estate, whether it's a condominium or a house or a car, something in the country, if they're not going to use it because it could be housing the homeless that exist right now, displaced people that exist right now. If you really want to tackle the problem by taking that right away, you become a protectionist country that other countries with capital will not want to invest in, and not just not invest in real estate, but not do business with us in terms of trade, of agricultural, industrial products, technology. They will simply say, you are moving to a protectionist, socialist economy. And if you are not going to let real estate prices rise and fall with the indices that are international and not just domestic, and you're going to separate yourself from the economic alliances that we have with many European free trade alliances here in North America and with a variety of countries in Europe who are big investors, or with the Asian markets who have invested heavily in this country. And let's face it, the banks in this country love that, because that means the money's here and they get to invest it and make money on it. They're the ones writing the mortgages. They're the ones collecting the interest rates. Well, then a lot of people would say you're moving towards socialism. A lot of people exaggerate and say communism, but it hurts our economy. And as a result, counterintuitively, prices for everything here would go up even further, right? So, what, in a perfect world, in Thomas More's Utopia, say, we've got to get all our economic allies, all our democratic liberal allies around the world to play by the same rules. And I think the creation of the European Union was the beginning of that kind of an effort. But we're not there yet, because powerful economies that don't need Canada's input or trade will say, well, fuck you. We don't have to do business with you. So, and of course, and I should add, if you start saying that, let's say there's a lot of Chinese investment here in Toronto in terms of real estate, you say, well, you can't own this land here. China will retaliate and say, well, then you cannot have the cheap products that you depend on. Both phones of ours on the table, I would bet, were built in China by people who are making $2.50 an hour or maybe a day, whose lives are living hell, and they're jumping off the roofs of those factories, right? We don't seem to care. And we have absolutely no chance of convincing China how to run its domestic economy. We could create tariffs, as Donald Trump is suggesting, but they'll just retaliate, because we need their stuff, they need ours. So once again, you're at an impasse. And then you come to this place where people talk about global government. Well, global government's a dangerous thing, because what if the people who take over that global government decide they know what's best for all of us, control a global military industrial complex at our expense, and just tell us how it's going to be? We're back to then an age of serfdom, of slavery, really, to massive corporations. I often think now, because I often in my contribution to media am analyzing conflicts around the world. Both the conflict in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia, and the conflict between Israel and its neighbors at this point is generating millions of jobs in North America and Europe. They are what I call managed wars. Were there to be peace, millions of jobs would be lost in a day. Those people would be unable to pay their mortgages, pay their rent, or pay their groceries. And the cycle gets worse. So then people, and I'm using the word properly, the word radical to the root, say this might finally be time for the revolution. Some revolution that delivers social equity, economic justice to all. Never has that ended well, whether it was in Russia with the Bolshevik Revolution, whether it was in China with Mao, who killed millions of his own people, Khmer Rouge in right next door to China, right, Cambodia, revolutions in South Asia historically, the war and the continued tension between Pakistan and India. All of these are examples of entities or groups. Now we can use Hezbollah, Hamas, the Yemenis, some of the population of Syria who are Alawites, and Iran as an economic military bloc that subscribe to a religion that seeks world dominion in the name of their God, Allah. And they say if we were running the world, everyone would be treated with grace and everybody would be treated, well, not treated, but everybody would be entitled to a home, to the right to eat, to raise their family in peace. I've seen no evidence that the leadership of any of those groups, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades, the IRGC, seems to me whenever they get a chunk of power, things get worse for their people, not better. The United States has been the most powerful economy in the world for decades. They have more poor and more people in their jails per capita right now in a developed country, I'm not talking about an African country or a South Asian country, than any country in the world. And they are supposed to be the beacon of light, compassion, opportunity for all. I don't smell a revolution in Toronto. I smell discomfort. I smell frustration. I often find as I take the subway, I feel sad. I certainly don't feel frightened. But I don't see an organizer or an impetus that would organize, collectivize, and turn the homeless, the displaced, and those living, just paycheck to paycheck, not able to buy the foods that would actually keep them healthy, not able to access education that they need to succeed in a rapidly evolving world that demands new skills and new technologies, not by every generation, but in every year. I do not see any such organization. And I also want to remind you that index after index, Canada is still considered the most peaceful, prosperous, fair, and compassionate country to live in the world.
Thank you. My last point for you on this topic, as Indigenous individuals make up 15% of Toronto's homeless population, how can federal initiatives better support their unique needs and promote healing through reconciliation?
Well, I've spent a lot of time with Indigenous populations in this country, visited a lot of reserves. I've gotten to know some of them, have worked with them both here and abroad. Separating them from the rest of the herd creates additional tension on the streets of our community. The minute you start talking about, so really, I think you're asking me the question, as the first settlers, the first colonialists of this continent, because they came from the Cynic world, they walked that bridge over from Asia. I mean, I saw somebody very clever say the other day, the only people in this world who aren't settlers are the people who were born and their descendants in the Nile Valley, where this generation of Homo sapien anthropologists theorize were sort of born and evolved from. So if you're a displaced person from the Middle East or from Africa, and you come here, and you're told, because you both had to leave your homeland, that the settlers who were here first, indigenous, natives as they used to be called, the first humans to have North America, they asked themselves, why are these people getting special treatment? I too have been displaced, right? You can use the Jews as an example as well. I mean, I've noticed the indigenous people in this country, in large part, seem to be supporting Israel and the Jews because, of course, there were the 12 tribes of Judaism that came out of North Africa and took the land that they believed God gave them to build a civilization. It's ironic that they're called colonialists, even though they were there first. Not really defending any side over there. All war is a war crime, and there has to be a solution. But when you start talking about the indigenous population as a population that is suffering more than other displaced people, migrants, homeless people, that number might be correct. I don't know if it's correct or not, but I do know that most Canadians would be affronted if you said to them, they're getting to the front of the line. Because at the end of the day, those other homeless people, displaced people, marginalized people, people on the edge of security and survival, work just as hard as my indigenous friends and believe under our Charter of Rights and Freedoms that they should have the same rights and the same access to resources that the indigenous people do. There is no question that what we did as European settlers when we arrived to North America was, if there is a time to use the word genocide, there you go. That was a genocide. Not a wholesale one, but it was very close, right? And so we just passed Truth and Reconciliation Day. One thing, of course, we've had to do is acknowledge that we did this, whether it was residential schools, whether it was breaking treaties, whether it was infecting them with smallpox, whether it was just killing them outright when we met them, because our technology was much more advanced than theirs when we arrived. There has to come a time, and I'm no real John Lennon sort of fan, where we are going to have to acknowledge that the travesties and the evil of history must be acknowledged. But if we're going to move forward and reunite the communities in this multi-ethnic town that we live here in Toronto, that the color of your skin is irrelevant, the faith you practice, unless you're preaching hate, is irrelevant, and the history of your ethnic origin might be recognized, but should not entitle you to first in line or advantages. That's a very impolitic thing to say. I'm sure I'm going to get in trouble for saying it, but that conversation is formed by the dialogues I've had with leaders in the indigenous community in this country. They recognize that it almost works against them when they are separated from the rest of Canadian citizenry or landed immigrancy and singled out for special treatment or compensation, or they're given a different set of rules. They're not policed by the same police that we're policed by. They're not taxed by the same standards we are. That's creating yet another division. And I want to close by saying this. It seems to me that the most effective tactic that, whether they're kleptocrats, oligarchs, CEOs, bank presidents, tyrant politicians, the number one tactic to control your population and protect the interests of a very small number of elites that you either golf with, or you dine with, or you grew up with, depending where, right? What do? And the United States is suffering this on a daily basis. You race bait. You separate people. You start to talk about what the black population is suffering and what they should maybe enjoy less or more. Ideas like affirmative action or not, which has both been a success and a failure. By separating those people, instead of all of us getting together and confronting the deep state, as the sleepy United States like to call them, or the elites, we leave the elites alone. We end up fighting amongst ourselves. Keeps us busy, doesn't solve anything. Namaste.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you for your time.